Today we are going to talk about negative strategy and counterplans. And please, if you have questions along the way, I will try to remember to stop for questions, but if you have one, just raise your hand and I'll call on you in case I don't remember to pause along the way. So we will get started. We're going to talk about some basics of negative strategy and thinking about being negative, and then we're going to talk about counterplans more specifically. So, first question, what is the job or the role of the negative in a debate? Yes, in the middle.
To convince the judge that they shouldn't vote for the plan
because reasons, yes, I agree. So to convince the judge not to vote for the I agree with that. How else might you think about what the negative is doing? Yeah?
Trying to prove that the plan will have to or not solve the problem.
Yeah, good. So, you might prove that the plan causes negative effects or has negative implications, and that it does not sufficiently resolve the problems that it has identified. Other thoughts about the role of the negative? Yeah?
To prove there is no issue.
Sorry, say that again?
To prove there is no issue.
To prove your what?
There's no issue, there's no problem.
No issue? Sure, yeah. So to mitigate the claims being made by the affirmative. How does the negative go about accomplishing these things? Peter.
By attacking the affirmative's case, so like advantages, solvency.
For sure. So in order to disprove the claims being made by the affirmative, the negative says the things that the affirmative has said on their case are incorrect. That's kind of the category of case defense or case arguments that we often talk about. What else does the negative do in order to do their job? Yes, Aaron?
Is offense and defense?
Yeah, good. So the negative presents offense, and offense being, what does offense mean? Let's use our hands just so we can all be on the same page. I saw your hand. Oh, sure. So offense can be a disadvantage. What does offense mean kind of more generically? Johnny.
That the affirmative does something bad.
Okay, so an example would be saying that AF does something bad. Yes?
It's more of like you're supporting your case, or not supporting your case, but like attacking the other person rather than defense, which is like preventing your case from being attacked.
Yeah, so I like to think about offense and defense as offense being reasons to vote for you. So reasons that the judge should vote for you, for your side. And defense as reasons the judge should not vote for the other side. Does that distinction make sense? So offense says, here's an active reason that you should vote for us. Defense says, here's a reason you should not vote for the other team. Does that distinction kind of make sense? So, bear with me for many of you. This is repetitious, but off case and on case. What is the difference? Teddy.
Off case is your means either when you're not talking about the stuff threatened in the 1AC, you're not talking about the advantages presented there, and on case when you're talking about the advantages. So whether you're presenting maybe defense on why the affirmative can't solve their problems, or offense on why the affirmative the solution would be bad.
Okay, yeah, more or less. So off-case arguments are arguments presented by the negative in the 1NC that are not answering the arguments made by the 1AC. And on-case arguments are the set of arguments that are made on the case. That's defining the word by using it, but on-case arguments are responses to the claims that are made by the 1AC. Right? And what kind of role does each of those play in negative strategy? This sort of gets back to the offense-defense question. Yeah, in the back.
Off cases are a little more offensive, and on cases like defensive with defending what they said?
Yeah, good. So generally speaking, and there are exceptions that we'll talk about, including today, but off-case arguments are often offensive arguments for the negative, whereas case arguments often are defensive reasons not to vote for the 1AC. Again, lots of kind of exceptions or caveats, but that's kind of a conceptual map for what those things are. And we just talked about offense, defense. Now, can either of those, yes?
Can you repeat your definition for what all case was?
Off-case arguments are arguments presented by the negative in the 1NC that are not answering arguments made by the 1AC, but are reasons to vote for the negative.
Okay, and then for on-case?
On-case arguments are responses to the claims made by the 1AC. Now, to immediately contradict myself, I'm going to answer the question that I put up here. Can on-case arguments ever be offensive for the negative? Yeah, the answer is yes. Go ahead. Good. So turns, arguments that the case is backwards, not just incorrect, but wrong, actively wrong in some direction, are offensive argument, can be offensive arguments for the negative. In some of your speeches that you've had this week, have you seen examples of that in the camp evidence? Parker.
Oh, like an example from
Yeah.
the packet? Sure. Like I think it's the first turn in the 1NC shell, which is like the plan causes overcommitment, which fractures the alliance. That.
Good. And just to briefly discuss this, so Parker says there's an argument in the negative packet that says the plan causes overcommitment, which undermines the alliance. And the 1AC said we shore up the NATO alliance, right? That's kind of one of the thesis claims of the 1AC. So if the negative says you undermine or fracture the alliance, that is offense, right? That is a turn. Does that make sense to everyone? And so that would be a reason to vote negative, not just you are wrong, but you are so wrong that you cause the impacts that you're trying to solve. What kind of turn is that?
An impact turn?
I like that you're categorizing that correctly, but it is actually a link turn.
Okay.
So a link turn says the set of claims you've made about the things that you cause are backwards, and you cause the thing that you're trying to solve. An impact turn says that the impact that you solve is actually good. So what might an impact turn be for the 1AC that we see in the packet? Parker.
Democracy collapse good.
Yeah, so there's some democracy claims in the 1AC. If you said democracy is bad, democratic collapse is good, that would be an impact turn. Yeah.
Need a clap, good, EU, SEPSO, stuff like that.
Yep, NATO collapse good would be another example of an impact turn argument that we could make that would be offense for the neg rather than just defense. So, thinking about the role of the negative and the process that you're going through when you're negative, the negative starts with a combination of off-case and on-case arguments. So you know in the demo debate yesterday, there was an off-case argument, which was what? And then a set of on-case arguments. They said they read some turns like we talked about, and then they made some defensive arguments. So a combination of those different things, right? It's important to note that usually, and in fact, you saw a good example of this yesterday, all of the arguments that are presented in the 1NC will not be in the 2NR, the final speech that the negative gives, right? So the process throughout the debate, the negative is selecting which arguments they want to go for at the end of the debate, right? So you start with a diverse set of arguments and you end up with a particular subset of the arguments that you began with at the end of the debate. So you're increasingly selective throughout the debate. And it's important to remember that in the 2NR, you will have one kind of world that you're going for. And when I say world, what I mean is one set of arguments that you want the judge to think about that are cohesive and hang together. So in the 2NR, you're not going to say, here's two different disadvantages and some case arguments, You're going to choose one kind of disadvantage, one offensive argument with defense to the claims that the AF has made. So I want to hone in a little bit on this concept of choice, because I just said the negative is choosing arguments throughout the debate, and I want to really think about why that's the case. Why do you think the negative needs to choose from the arguments that they're making and doesn't go for everything that they said in the 1NC? Yeah?
It's not efficient for time. You can't address everything perfectly, so it's better to go for certain things and be stronger on it.
Good. So you just don't have enough time? Absolutely. What were you going to say a little bit further back?
Oh, I was going to say the same thing.
Okay, yeah, so absolutely. So we'll talk more about this in a minute, but are there other reasons that you might want to select which arguments you're going for? Yes?
Sometimes other arguments might be stronger than others, so we want to attack the weaker argument.
Good, yeah, so you want to go for your best arguments by the end of the debate. And so not all arguments are created equal. Some are better than others. You want to go for a combination of arguments that produces the highest likelihood that you'll win the debate. Yes?
You also don't want to accidentally contradict yourself.
For sure. So you want your set of arguments by the end of the debate to be consistent with one another and not contradictory. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but I agree. Yes?
As a neg, one of the advantages you have with the AF is that you can pick certain arguments. So like yesterday, they read a turn, and then the AF read 2 cards in response to that turn, and they like dropped that turn to carry it through. So if the AF responds really well to like an argument that you're reading, you don't need to carry it through the debate if you know that you don't have the possibility to win on it.
Good, absolutely. So if it turns out that the AF has the business, they're like on their game, they have great answers to an argument that you have, it is your choice. You do not have to go for that argument. And so choosing allows you to go for arguments that maybe the AF didn't cover as well. I want to drill down a little bit more on this question of time. So time, in any game that you play, and debate is a game, any game has units of strategy that help one side or another win, right? So like, what's a game? Name any game.
Checkers.
Checkers, good. What's, oh, hi Sam.
Hello.
What is the unit that each side is trying to accumulate in a game of checkers?
Checkers.
Yeah, the little plastic things, right? The actual checkers themselves. What's another game?
Chess.
Chess, okay. What is the unit that you're using in chess?
Pieces.
And you want the pieces to reach the other side, right? I don't really know chess very well, but I think that's right.
Kind of.
Okay, so in debate, obviously it's all about arguments, but the unit of strategy that is kind of useful to think about for the purposes of our discussion is time. So both sides have an equal amount of time, of speech time that they're giving, but you do not spend an equal amount of time on all arguments. And generally speaking, whoever spends the most time by the end of the debate on critical arguments will win the debate. So raise your hand if you voted AF in yesterday's debate. Good to see that the lab was consistent with the rest of the camp. In our lab, at least, many people voted AF because they thought that the case outweighed the dissent. Who spent more time on that argument throughout the debate? The AF, right? So you were convinced the case outweighs the dissent, and it just so happens the AF got to say more things about that argument than the negative said, right? So time is a unit of strategy in which whoever spends the most time on critical issues in a debate tends to win. So on the negative, what we're trying to do is to use that to our advantage, right? So instead of, well, the AF got to spend more time on these critical arguments so they automatically won, we want to invert that and spend more time on critical arguments than the AF is spending. Does that make sense? How do we do that? How does the negative accomplish spending more time on critical issues? Eli?
Both their ability to introduce arguments in the 1C and then drop those later.
Yeah, what you're fundamentally saying is by choosing some of their arguments, by having a set of different arguments they make in the 1 and C, and then by going for some particular arguments that they select, right? On a quick tangent, why is it so easy to be F? Peter?
You get the first and the last speech.
You get to speak first and last. I totally agree. Yes? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in a normal debate, you know what your act is going to be, and other people don't necessarily know that.
Yep, so you know what you're going to say. You have chosen the kind of terms and set of arguments that will structure the debate, and the other team doesn't necessarily. Maybe they'll find out right before. Maybe won't find out until the debate starts. Yes, in the front.
You don't necessarily have to think of a new plan. You can just kind of say, here's why we should do this. You don't have to think of like a counter plan or like things that could like complicate your strategy.
For sure. So you get to kind of pick and defend a consistent set of arguments throughout the debate. Any other reasons you think that it is easy to be F? If we think, yeah.
You get to choose what the debate is about.
Yep, you get to choose what the debate is about.
You can't run like the same cases like every debate, but if you're asked, you can practice it.
That's true. Yeah.
You get the advantage of prep, like you can know what both disads or CPs or like critiques are going to be, and
right.
so you can kind of prepare for those, versus if you're neg, the tone of the debate, it depends entirely on what the act is, so you can only prepare for that so much.
Yeah, so sometimes we talk about this as the negative being reactive. The negative has to react to whatever the 1AC says, and that whereas the F gets to be proactive and select the things that they're going to say. Definitely agree with that. The other thing about being F is that there is a built-in time advantage, and this relates to what Peter was saying about the first and last speech, right? So that F gets the very last speech in the debate, which means that they get to choose which arguments matter the most, right? So they get to say, here is the set of arguments that is most important, and then spend more time than the negative gets on those arguments. Does that make sense? So we on the negative, our job is to combat the F's structural advantages by making strategic choices about which arguments we think are important and using those to our benefit. I want to quickly detour, as someone mentioned this earlier, but I want to make sure that we cover it. So, someone mentioned the negative gets to kick arguments. So when you're not going for something that you said in the 1 and C, that is called kicking an argument. And I want to just make sure that everyone's on the same page that when you're not going for an argument that you made initially in the debate, you need to kick out of it, and you do so by conceding F defensive arguments that make it impossible for any offensive arguments to apply. Can anyone give me an example? Yes, over here.
For example,
Behind you, not Teddy. Teddy's person behind Teddy.
If they act read the impact turn and then allow the no link argument, then the negative takes the link argument and then the impact turn.
Good. So let's say that the F in response to a disad said there's no link, the plan doesn't cause, whatever the thing is, and they said impact turn, the thing that you said was bad is actually good. And then if you're neg and you're like, I'm really scared of that impact turn, I don't have answers to it, or whatever, you can concede the no link argument because it takes out the implication of the impact turn. What speech did I just say sets the order for the arguments on off-case positions? Parker. What?
The 2AC?
Good. So that we're going in 2AC order. The 2AC order of arguments sets the structure for the rest of the debate. What speech sets the order or structure for arguments on the case? Yes?
The 1 and C?
Good, yeah, the 1 and C. So we're going in 1 and C order on the arguments on the case. The first speech that sets the order for the debate is the 1 and C. So On the case, you're going in 1NC order. Remember that we're choosing because we're not going for everything. And we are selecting particular arguments that we want to extend. And we're still using EAR. We're using extend, answer, analyze, and read for arguments on the case. In the block, it's important to remember that you need to kick out of arguments that you're not going for, unless it's a T argument or a case argument. Block structure kind of making sense to people? I want to talk about argument proliferation a little bit. What do I mean by argument proliferation? Does anyone know what proliferation is? Ted?
The expanding and making more. So argument proliferation might be making more arguments, like if they read, you know, the uniqueness, the link, the internal link, and the impact for a BizCon dissent, you want to say 2 or 3 reasons why it has uniqueness, 2 or 3 reasons why there's not a link, 2 or 3 reasons why there's no internal link, and then maybe 2 reasons why there's no impact.
Yeah, so proliferation, argument proliferation just means the making of many more arguments from one. There's a difference between horizontal and vertical proliferation. So horizontal proliferation refers to the idea of kind of a bunch of different diverse and distinct arguments, making many, many different unique arguments. Vertical proliferation is the idea of making a bunch of distinct arguments from within a category or within a set of arguments. So that is kind of what Teddy was talking about when he said, you know, the 2AC says non-unique. Vertical proliferation would be I'm making 10 responses to that. Whereas horizontal proliferation would be I'm extending 4 different off-case positions, which is probably too much for the reasons that we've discussed, but that is, you know, horizontal proliferation. So if we think about our discussion of strategy and time, which form of proliferation is likely to be more beneficial for the negative? Yeah?
Horizontal.
Why?
Because you have to like save time and you have to answer between C.
Okay, anyone else have a thought? Yes?
You don't have to read the penalty pinches the other open.
Okay. So these two think horizontal proliferation is the best form of argument proliferation in the block. This is a pretty common way of thinking about things, but I want to kind of adjust your thinking. Aaron?
Vertical, because you're expanding your arguments to where they're like better. Instead of having like all these unique arguments, you're starting to narrow down to where you can get to your one where all the ones are on there.
Good. Okay, so I disagree with the two at the back. Vertical proliferation is the direction that you want to go in the block for the reasons that Aaron just said, which is you're building upon and improving the nuance of each of the arguments that you're making in order to set up your best possible 2 and R and to make the choice easier for you. And remember that discussion of time, this means that you're spending more time on each argument than the AF has, and means that you can spend more time on it than the AF possibly can, right? Again, 13 minutes of the block versus 5 minutes of the 1AR. If you have spent a great deal of time on each 2AC argument, it is much harder for the 1AR to spend as much time on those arguments, right? Does that make sense? And so the next thing, the kind of minimum that we want for each 2AC argument uses the formula of 2x plus 1. So if the 2AC made 1 argument, how many arguments should you make in response?
3.
Good. If the 2AC made 2 arguments, how many arguments should you make in response? 5. Algebra is, I liked algebra, but it's, you know, it takes some work. So 2 times the number of arguments that the 2AC has made plus 1 is the formula for how many arguments you want in the block on each 2AC argument. Does everyone kind of see how that structure enables you to proliferate vertically and kind of make it harder for the AF? Cool. Now the fun part. Counterplans. A counterplan is an advocacy presented by the negative argued to be preferable to the affirmative. An advocacy that the negative presents that they say is preferable to the affirmative. The burden of a counterplan, so that, you know, the 1AC has a plan. Negative, we have a counterplan. Kind of makes logical sense, right? So we get an advocacy to say, instead of doing the thing that the AF said, we should do something else. So all the other arguments, well, not all the other arguments, but many of the other arguments that we've talked about are like, you know, the AF causes something bad, or the AF, you know, doesn't solve, and all that stuff. This is saying there's a different thing that we should do that is better. The burden of a counterplan starts with competing with the affirmative. So a counterplan must compete with the affirmative. What do I mean by compete with? Yeah.
So doesn't it mean that you would lose on permutation because they have to be different from each other? You can't do one and the other. It has to be just one.
Right, yeah, go ahead.
That would be like the mutually, they have to be mutually exclusive.
Right, so we'll get to mutual exclusivity in a second, but generally speaking, that you cannot do both, right? So a counterplan must compete insofar as it cannot be done in combination with the thing that the AF said. Did you have something to add, Parker?
Just to say counterplans have to be like functionally and textually competitive.
We'll get there.
Okay.
So there's two ways that a counterplan can compete, and one was just referenced. A counterplan can be mutually exclusive with the AF. What does that mean? Peter.
The two, like the affirmative and the counterplan, cannot function together because they're exclusive of each other.
Okay, so cannot both be done together because one cancels the other out. Logically or legally, etc., cannot be done in combination. That is mutual exclusivity. The second way that a counterplan can compete is through net benefits. It can be net beneficial. The counterplan can be net beneficial. Does anyone know what that means? Yes?
It would give more overall benefit than the plan would. Like it would maybe solve more and be like overall better.
Sort of. That's good start. Johnny?
It avoids the disadvantage that the affirmative will be linked to.
Good. So net beneficial means that the counterplan avoids some negative consequence that the affirmative causes. The counterplan avoids a disadvantage triggered by the affirmative. That is what it means for a counterplan to be net beneficial. Another way of thinking about all of this is to say that counterplans demonstrate opportunity costs to the plan. An opportunity cost refers to the value of a foregone choice that is given up by making a different choice. Does that make sense? So if you make one choice, you are foreclosing the opportunity to make other choices. A counterplan is saying that that foregone opportunity that is given up by doing the AF is so significant as to outweigh the AF. Yeah, Aziz.
Sorry, could you explain mutually exclusive again?
Mutually exclusive means that the plan and the counterplan cannot logically or legally both be done at the same time. What? Right, so a permutation doesn't work because they're mutually exclusive. Yeah?
Could you go over the opportunity costs one more time?
Opportunity cost means that when you make a particular choice, you are foreclosing the opportunity to make distinct other choices. So if I decide to go to, I came here this morning to give this lecture, I foreclosed the opportunity to go do a bunch of other stuff. So, the counterplan could be I should have gone to the gym, and I foreclosed that opportunity by coming here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, so couldn't this could work in tandem with like a politics DA, because it sounds kind of similar, like with political capital. Like if you use your political capital for this, you can't use it for something else that's really important.
Yeah, that's true. It's opportunity cost is definitely a similar theory or theme to political capital. Yeah.
Okay.
Generally speaking, is a counterplan offense or defense for the negative? Peter.
Counterplans are usually defensive.
Yep. Why is that?
Because they, unlike an offensive argument, which would say that the app causes something bad, the counterplan usually says that the counterplan solves better than the affirmative because the affirmative can't solve, or they're wrong. Not that they're bad.
Good. Yeah, so the counterplan says there is a different way. We think back to case defense where we're saying that app is incorrect about some stuff. A counterplan is saying you went about dealing with a problem in this way, but there are other ways to deal with the problem. It does not say you dealing with the problem is itself a problem, is bad, right? Does that difference check out? 1 second. Yes, Aaron.
Do counterplans get the privilege of fiat?
Yes, counterplans use fiat. What do I mean when I say that? Yeah, in the back.
It's assumed if like when it's going to be passed, it's going to happen.
Say that again?
The counterplan's going to happen if the negative wins on it. It's like
assuming that the counterplan would be done, yes. The fiat refers to the idea that we're talking about whether something should be done, not whether it would be done. And so counterplans, much like AF plans, say it would be good if this happened. We're not going to talk about is it possible for it to happen. We're going to assume that it is possible. Did you have a question?
So if you do a counter plan, you can't, you're like conceding that there even is a problem, so you can't do like topicality.
Good question. So you can, in the 1NC, you can absolutely make both of those arguments at the same time. In the block, even, you can have both of those arguments. You can have T and a counterplan and a disadd, and you're good. By the 2 and R, I would not do both of those things.
Yeah, because wouldn't you be contradicting yourself?
Sort of. It's less, you know, you could think about T and a counterplan as like, even if they're topical, there's another way to go about it. I don't think that there's necessarily a contradiction. So there's kind of other reasons that you would not go for both. But yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions so far? Okay. When I say that the counterplans are defensive, that is the vast majority of time that is the case, but there are exceptions which we will talk about today. So one way of thinking about counterplans, people really like this example. Let's say that the affirmative plan says we should go to McDonald's for lunch. And the reason we should go to McDonald's, the advantage that we're trying to solve is that we're hungry and we're trying to get food. So we're going to go to McDonald's for lunch. That solves the fact that we're hungry. Great, great plan, love it, sounds good. A counterplan that could be presented by the negative might be, instead of McDonald's, we should go to Chipotle. And there's two, you know how I said there's two ways that the counterplan can compete? Mutual exclusivity and net benefits. Which way does it compete to say we should go to Chipotle instead of McDonald's? Aziz. You're going to have to speak way up. Okay, why is that?
Lunch is usually 1 meal, so can't really get
Yeah, so we only have a finite amount of time. Lunch is 1 meal. It doesn't make sense to do both. We're just going to do one. You might also say we should actively not go to McDonald's because it's unhealthy, right? And so Chipotle, as a counterplan, solves the advantage of being hungry, but avoids the unhealthy implications of going to McDonald's. Does that make sense? And you can also say we can't do both of those at the same time because we only have, you know, so much time and we're not able to do both. Now the AF might say Chipotle is also unhealthy, and we'll talk about what kind of argument that is. But generally speaking, does this check out? So, why do we read counterplans? What do they do? Ted.
Counterplans provide defense in that even if you don't win case, you can still weigh your offense without having to worry about a case outweigh.
For sure. So counterplans provide a mechanism or way of beating the AF's offense without having to answer the particular claims with, individual defense. It is like a giant piece of defense. Similarly, and related to what Teddy said, counterplans narrow the debate to focus on your offense. The disad and all that other stuff that you have going on, counterplans can obviate some of the things that the AF has said to make it enabling you to focus on offense that you have. Does that make sense? Counterplans can also, and this is a little bit of a twist, provide uniqueness. Does anyone know what I mean by that? Ted.
Let's say you have an oil disad, but normally would not have uniqueness because, like Biden is regulating natural gas right now. You could do a counterplan to say Biden should unregulate, should allow for new fracking or whatever, and that would give uniqueness to your disad.
Absolutely. So you remember when I said that counterplans get fiat? You can use fiat to mitigate or get out of uniqueness problems with your disad. Because you can counterplan to change what's going on so that any issues in the status quo that are likely to cause your disad, you can make them go away. Yes?
So is it basically generates uniqueness, is just like it addresses the status quo? Okay.
Yeah, it addresses issues that you might have with uniqueness for your disad.
Okay.
So that's a twist that we'll talk about a little bit more. Types of counterplans. Maybe the most common type of counterplan is just an advantage counterplan. An advantage counterplan is a way to deal with the advantages that the AF has presented in a different way. So the AF says, here's a bunch of bad stuff that's going to happen if we don't do the plan. The plan resolves these issues. An advantage counterplan says, these issues might be real, but there's another way to go about solving them. Advantage counterplans usually compete through net benefits. They're not usually mutually exclusive with the plan. If I say we should implement a tax on carbon to solve global warming, and the negative says we should do a bunch of geoengineering to solve global warming, both of those things could be possible, right? Like we could do both of those things. It is theoretically feasible and possible. But if I said that a carbon tax kills the economy, that is a net benefit to the advantage counterplan to do a bunch of geoengineering. Right? Yeah.
Can you also say that geoengineering also hurt the economy?
The AF could say that. The AF could say geoengineering hurts the economy as well, so it links to the net benefit. That is true. You would want your link, the negative would want their link to be very specific to a carbon tax and would hope that you do not have geoengineering, evidence about geoengineering's effects on the economy. You always want your links to be specific to the plan so that you can generate net benefits. Examples. So the counterplan that you'll talk about in your labs today from the evidence packet is the mutual restraint counterplan. It has the U.S. negotiate with Russia to both agree not to do election interference and other kind of cyber misbehavior. That is an example of an advantage counterplan. Any can you think of other advantage counterplan ideas that you might use to solve the affirmative in the packet? Yeah.
Cooperate with NATO to build
Okay, cooperate with NATO to build up cyber defense. So rather than changing Article 5, just say like, all right, we're going to shore up our defenses against cyber attacks. Good. What would the net benefit to that be?
that putting it in Article 5 causes subtraction.
Good. Yeah. So changing Article 5 is bad for the alliance, or it's bad for some other reason. So your net benefit would need to be about Article 5. Good. Second category of counterplans, PICs. PICs are plan-inclusive counterplans. Counterplans that do some, but not all, of the affirmative plan. A PIC is a counterplan that does some, but not all, of the affirmative plan, with some offense or some, disadd that is related to the part of the plan that is not done. Right? An example of a PIC against the cyber app in the packet would be there's a couple of examples that I put up there. One is to pick out of information warfare. So to say, yes, we should change Article 5, but we should not include specifically information warfare. It should only be attacks on infrastructure or physical, cyber attacks that constitute physical damage rather than information warfare, and read a disadd to changing Article 5 to include information warfare. Another example might be to pick out of cooperation and to say that cooperation with NATO is bad, but the U.S. should unilaterally, declare that information warfare constitutes an attack that the U.S. would retaliate to, but not cooperate with NATO and say that the cooperation is bad. So some but not all of the plan with offense against the part of the plan that you're not doing. Third is agent counterplans. Agent counterplans are a type of PIC that pick out of the agent of the AF's plan. Oh, yes, Aziz? So, I'm sorry, I can't hear you at all.
Are PICs usually mutually exclusive?
Oh, great question. Often, yes. So PICs often are competitive because they're mutually exclusive, because you can't both do, change Article 5 to include cyber or information warfare and not do that, right? Often mutually exclusive. Great question. Agent counterplans. Yes.
Oh, I had a question about agent counterplans.
Yes.
So would 50 states CP be an agent counterplan because you're changing the agent, or could it also be an advantage because the states would be a different mechanism than the U.S. government?
It's an agent counterplan.
Okay.
States is an agent counterplan because the AFTA uses the federal government, the counterplan uses the 50 states. In some sense, and I think this is a good question, in some sense all counterplans are advantage counterplans because they're all different mechanisms to solve, mostly. I should not have said all. But most counterplans that are trying to solve the AF could be classified as advantage counterplans, but more specifically, that is an agent counterplan. Yes?
Similar question, would you say a RevNeg counterplan is an agent counterplan?
I would not.
Okay, would you say advantage counterplan, or what would you classify?
It is a process counterplan, which is what we're about to talk about. So, agent counterplans have, one agent do the plan. So NATO do the plan is an agent counterplan that we could identify for the packet F. An agent counterplan is also a type of PIC, just to make it confusing. Right, because you're picking out a part of the plan, but you're having an agent do the same, a different actor do the same thing as the plan. So it is also a type of PIC. Next type of counterplan, a process counterplan. So a process counterplan changes the process by which the plan is implemented or enacted. or done. So a counterplan that changes the process by which the plan is done. And an example was just raised, someone said the RegNeg counterplan. The RegNeg refers to regulatory negotiations and says that before a plan is implemented, we should negotiate with the industry that would be affected and find out kind of their views and their take on what would happen. So on last year's water topic, that might make some sense for industries that would be affected by water regulations. RegNeg does not make a ton of sense against this affirmative, I don't think, which is not to say that you would not hear it, but you know, it's an international, because it's an international relations topic that's maybe a little less relevant. However, something that we'll probably hear on this topic that is a process counterplan is consultation. So a consultation counterplan says we should ask someone before we do the plan. Like, for example, we should ask Nato how they feel about Article 5 before we make changes to it. And then says that the process of acting, the process of asking is good. Here's a tricky one. How do process counterplans compete? Yes.
Because if you're doing two different plans that have the same end goal, but you're doing them two different methods or like two different processes, they may not be mutually exclusive. Like if one of them is like, you're trying to do these security things through the US with NATO, but then maybe there's a counterplan that's like NATO, like a different NATO country needs to introduce it, it may be hard to have both countries introduce the change.
Okay.
Or like it may not be mutually exclusive because of the different paths that you would have to take to get there.
Okay, so you can say that it's mutually exclusive because it doesn't make sense to have the processes are so different that they can't coexist. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, Teddy, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, just in general, process counterplans usually have some reason. Like, I feel a process counterplan for politics this adds, and some bad, usually pretty bad reasons why, like, the process counterplan does, like, make people not angry and therefore doesn't use up political capital.
Yeah, so sometimes I think that both of these are right. Sometimes it's mutual exclusivity, sometimes it's net benefits. A lot of times the arguments are a little bit contrived. Did you have something, Emisi?
Oh, I was just gonna like lean more towards like net beneficial, because like if you just kind of like do it without like consulting NATO, like if you consult NATO first, the benefit to that would be like, oh, like if they decide yes they're gonna do it, they're like more committed to it. I don't know if that makes sense. Like more committed to like doing the plan.
Yeah, so the net benefit might be based on that process that you're talking about, that it's like the NATO countries need to get on board and they'll only get on board if we consult, kind of thing. Yes?
Could you explain normal means evidence a bit more?
I haven't gotten there yet. Oh, I haven't. I should have. Yes, requires normal means evidence. Yes, I will definitely explain that. So, for process counterplan to compete, there are sometimes net benefits, as we just talked about, or they compete through what's called normal means. So, normal means is the idea that the plan, as presented, would normally or by standard processes occur in a particular way. Like the way that the plan would happen is it would go through Congress, Biden would sign it, it would go through reconciliation, etc. And the counterplan changes the process by which it would occur and says that the counterplan is not normal means. It is not the way the plan would normally be done, and thus it competes or is distinct from the plan. Mm-hmm. Thank you for pointing that out. I forgot that was up there. Yes?
So what are alternative ways of the plan to be passed that the process of could like say?
So in the RegNeg example, it's like the plan would normally just be done. The regulatory negotiation says instead of just doing it, we should first consult the industry. And we would say normally that would not be part of the process, but we are implementing that step before the plan is implemented. Or sometimes people read, agent counterplans are sometimes considered a type of process counterplan. And so you could read normal means evidence. It's like, this would normally be presidential action. We're going to make it congressional action. Does that make sense? Other questions so far? And then finally, we talked about this a little bit before, but uniqueness counterplans generate uniqueness for a disad. So if you were worried about the uniqueness problems, if you were reading the international law disad in your packet and you were to say, well, information warfare might already constitute an armed attack or might already constitute a use of force that would justify response, and so the disad is non-unique, you could explicitly declare that that was not the case in order to generate uniqueness. Explicitly declare information warfare does not constitute an armed attack, so we have uniqueness for our disad. Make sense? All right. Now we're going to talk about the theoretical foundations of counterplans and different types of counterplan theory. A lot, because what's the big difference between a counterplan and the other arguments that you know, like, let's just keep it simple. What's the big difference between a counterplan and a disad? Besides one is offense and one is defense. Parker.
Counterplans are conditional?
Nope, we're not there yet.
Okay.
Peter.
Counterplans offer like a solvency mechanism, or they offer like a counter plan, whereas disads are just like the app does something bad, the counterplan actually offers an alternative to the plan in the first place.
Right, using what?
The counterplan test.
Yes, we talked about this a couple minutes ago. Aaron asked the question. Counterplans use something that the app also uses. Teddy?
Yeah.
Fiat, good. Yeah, so counterplans use fiat. I forget why I wanted to say that. Counterplans use fiat, which is the big difference between a counterplan and a disad. Oh, this raises all kinds of ruckus for the app. The app is going to have all kinds of problems with the things that the negative is doing. A long time ago, not that long ago, a couple decades ago, it was argued that the negative should not get to use fiat at all. And the app would say there's no negative fiat. The affirmative only gets fiat because we are proving a resolution to be true and there is no negative resolution. So the negative ought not to get to use fiat at all. That is not something that you're likely to hear nowadays. Maybe occasionally someone will say that. It is generally pretty easy to defeat, but the point is the app gets all hot and bothered about the use of negative. And so there are a bunch of theoretical considerations. It introduces a whole different level of the debate, right? So the use of fiat by the negative introduces a whole host of different ways of thinking about debate that are different from the app causes something bad, you should vote neg on the dissent. Does that make sense? So the first category of counterplan theory to think about is competition theory. So when we talked about competition, we talked about, you know, the different ways that a counterplan can compete. The affirmative might want to say this counterplan ought not to compete. You should not consider this counterplan to be competitive with the affirmative. And we sort of talked about this earlier, or someone mentioned it. Kind of the test of this is a permutation. So an AF permutation is a test of competition, or a test of the competitiveness of the counterplan. Parker brought this up, but there are two types of ways that a counterplan can compete. Beyond mutual exclusivity and net benefits, the way that the counterplan can be demonstrated to be mutually exclusive, two ways of going about that or of thinking about that. The first is textual competition. Textual competition means that the counterplan excludes some or all of the words in the plan. Excludes some or all of the words in the plan. Functional competition is sort of the idea of textual competition, excluding some or all of the words in the plan, means that the permutation or the idea of doing both the plan and the counterplan is impossible because you can't both do a thing and then do a thing that does not include that part of it. You cannot do both an affirmative plan and this is the example that we talked about earlier, like it is mutually exclusive to do the plan and then do all of the plan but not this one part. Those are mutually exclusive. They don't make sense to do at the same time, right? Functional competition is the more traditional way of thinking about mutual exclusivity, where you functionally cannot do both at the same time. So the McDonald's Chipotle example, you cannot go to both at the same time. It doesn't make sense. You don't have enough time. They are functionally different alternatives that cannot both be done. And the key test of whether a counterplan is competitive is through permutations. So we kind of already said this, but what is a permutation? Okay, but those are kind of the words you would use, but kind of what are we talking about, Johnny?
Textual competition.
Okay, that's true. I did just say that, and that is accurate. But just like generically, just like conceptually, Eli.
You're going the plan of the affirmative as well as the plan of the plan of the negative.
Yeah, so a permutation is just a test of competition that says, can we both do the plan and do the thing that the negative said in the form of a counterplan? The negative should always have a defense of the competition theory that it undergirds or underlies the counterplan that you're reading. And this will make more sense when we talk a little bit more about some examples. So textual competition. What did we say textual competition was? Peter.
That the counterplan excludes or completely or has words that the counterplan text has words that are different from the apps.
Other way around, sort of. So you could have words that are different, but what is excluded? Some part of the plan is excluded, right? So not just different words, but deliberately does not say all of the words in the plan. So the arguments for textual competition being good, all this is kind of oversimplified, and you'll hear lots of different arguments for all of these methods of competition. But I wanted to go over some kind of basics. The arguments for why textual competition is good. First, the plan is kind of a stable and predictable locus for the debate. So the negative, has lots of disadvantages as we've discussed. And the plan is the only thing that the neg has to hang on to. The plan is one thing that we know is not going to change, that is going to be defended by the affirmative. Where we know that, we can research the words in the plan. We can kind of figure out what the plan is going to do and then say, here's our counterplan that is crafted around that particular locus. Second argument for why textual competition is good could be that it is objective. So the words in the plan versus the words in the counterplan, you can look at them and say, I know that the counterplan excludes some of the words in the plan. I'm good. I understand why they are distinct by just looking at the words. So it is an objective standard. Another argument might be that it is reciprocal, because it means the AF gets to defend their plan. The AF gets to generate offense from the parts of the plan that are not included in the counterplan. So the AF gets the whole plan to say that it's good. You chose the words in the plan, right? The AF, with all of their myriad advantages, got to select which words go in the plan. You ought to be able to defend those words, is kind of the reciprocity argument. And then another argument that people make for textual competition being good is that it excludes or limits out a bunch of counterplans that people say are cheating. So some of the examples that we talked about, like regulatory negotiations or regnag, or consultation counterplans. Those counterplans do not compete textually because they add words to the plan. Does that make sense? So textual competition good. Those are some reasons we might give. Textual competition, bad. We might say the textual competition is a bad standard. Arguments we might make for that include they incentivize the AF to write very vague plan texts. So if the AF knows that the counterplan, that the negatives counterplans are going to be generated from the way that the plan text is written, they're incentivized to use vaguer words, more broad terminology that cannot be, that is less likely to have picks compete. Is that making sense? So if your counterplan competes on excluding information warfare and you discover that there's really good evidence on why information warfare ought not to be included under Article 5, you might write a vaguer plan that doesn't include the words information warfare and try to get out of that. So textual competition incentivizes vague plan writing, which makes it harder for the negative because a vague plan is harder to debate. Second argument, textual competition is artificial. So it focuses only on the words that are in the plan and the counterplan and disregards the function of the plan and the counterplan. So it's artificial because it excludes or doesn't pay attention to the actual function of the plan and the counterplan. It's kind of a debate contrivance, you might say. Third, textual competition justifies word picks. What do you think a word pick is? You mean?
I mean, like, it's an inclusive counterplan, but like it changes the wording of the plan text.
Yep, and more specifically, a word pick changes one word. So entire plan except we changed one word. And people often say that word picks are bad because they're very silly. They focus the debate on some marginal aspect of the plan and cause bad debates in that way. Similarly, or on a related note, the last argument is that they're infinitely regressive, or textual competition is infinitely regressive, which is to say that if you take the plan and you're just considering that for the purposes of counterplan competition, there's kind of many things that you could say the counterplan competes on, including like the punctuation. So like you could pick out of like a comma or a semicolon and say the counterplan is different because it doesn't include that colon or semicolon. And so people say those counterplans are bad and that textual competition is bad because it justifies those types of counterplans. Now, functional competition. Functional competition, we might say, is good because it is logical. It tests what the plan and the counterplan actually do and decides whether they compete with each other based on what they actually do. Similarly, people say that it is more real world or more realistic because it is about the, ways in which the counterplan and the plan would play out or occur. And that is a, good form of education that we should have, is like we should debate competing proposals that are actually distinct from one another and actually compete with one another. People say that functional competition incentivizes good research for kind of similar reasons, that it, to have a functional counterplan, you got to find out what a functionally competitive counterplan, you got to find out what people are saying ought to be done instead of the plan, or find proposals that are considered in the literature that are distinct from the plan. And then people say functional competition is good because they avoid word scramble. So if your counterplan competes textually, it sort of incentivizes the AF kind of moving, when they permute, moving a bunch of words around. So avoids word scramble. Reasons functional competition might be bad. It is arbitrary or subjective. So what the function of the counterplan and the plan actually are can be debatable, right? Like, is it functionally competitive to, you know, go to McDonald's and go to Chipotle? Someone might say, like, you could actually do both of those things, but, like, it depends on how much time you have. So, like, there's an arbitrary or subjective element to figuring out whether a plan and a counterplan compete functionally. The third argument is that functional competition disregards or minimizes focus on the plan. So like you know, the arguments that we made for textual competition, we said that textual competition focuses on the plan, and that is good because it's such a stable, predictable source of offense for the AF and the neg. And so moving focus away from the plan to kind of some conception of what the plan, the implications of the plan, that is, you know, more difficult for the negative to debate. And then final argument is that functional competition excludes certain counterplans that ought to be included. So we might say this includes or excludes like the consultation counterplan or other counterplans that compete textually, and that excluding a certain category of counterplans is bad. In general, competition theory arguments will, on both sides, kind of broadly consider what types of counterplans are justified or, you know, included or excluded by that model of competition, and then say that those counterplans are either good or bad. Counterplan theory. We're still on counterplan theory. Category of counterplan theory. So this, the next kind of type of theory argument that you might encounter says that the category of the counterplan that you're reading should be procedurally disallowed from debate because it has negative effects on the types of debates that we have and on the kind of pedagogical model that it sets up for debate. So you might hear that international fiat is bad. So if you, one of the Asian counterplans example that we talked about was having a different country do the plan. You'll hear that having a different, the form of fiat that says another country should do the plan, that form of fiat is illegitimate. We talked a little bit about the states counterplan, that people say that 50 state fiat is bad. So it's a category, a question about the category of the counterplan. Generally speaking, like I said, this is about kind of the types of debates that such a counterplan sets up or, you know, promotes, and then says that that type of counterplan is bad for reasons of fairness or education. So either this type of counterplan is unfair, makes debate too, you know, difficult for the affirmative, or makes debate uneducational in some sense, like promotes learning about things that we should not be learning about, or does not support you know, things that we should be learning about. So distracts focus from the form of education that we should have. Third type of counterplan theory is theory about the status of the counterplan. So status theory says that the way in which the negative presents their counterplan is theoretically illegitimate. So someone, Parker, I think, mentioned this earlier. So counterplan status refers to the following. Under what conditions can the negative not go for the counterplan or kick the counterplan? Under what conditions can the negative not go for the counterplan? So we talked a little bit about, you know, other off-case positions and said you kick them, you kick out of a disad by conceding defensive arguments that take out the offense. So under what conditions can you kick out of a counterplan? There's three ways of reading a counterplan or statuses that a counterplan can have. The first is conditional. If you're reading your counterplan conditionally, it means that you can kick it at any time. If your counterplan is conditional, there are no circumstances under which you can be forced to go for the counterplan in the 2 hour. You can kick the counterplan at any time. So it doesn't matter what the 2AC says, it doesn't matter anything else that's happening in the debate. If your counterplan is conditional, you can not go for it if you don't feel like it. The second is dispositional. The definition of dispositionality is somewhat contested, and you'll hear it defined in different ways at different times. But generally speaking, the idea will be that a dispositional counterplan, the negative has to go for it if the AF straight turns it. So if the AF only makes offensive arguments, only says here are the bad externalities that this counterplan causes, that is, in that world, the negative has to go for the counterplan. It's the same way with a disadd. If there are only offensive arguments, the negative has to extend the disadd. Dispositionality means if the counterplan, if only offensive arguments are made, the negative has to go for the, has to extend the counterplan. Yes?
Could you go over conditional and unconditional again?
So I haven't gotten to unconditional yet.
Oh, okay.
I went out of order. But conditional means we can kick it at any time. There's no circumstances under which we are forced to go for the counterplan.
Okay.
Unconditional is the exact opposite. So the third status for a counterplan is unconditional. It means that we will definitely go for it in the 2 and R. Unconditional means that we will absolutely go for the counterplan in the 2 and R no matter what happens in the debate. Yeah?
Can you give an example of like a distinction between them?
Well, so if you're reading the counterplan on the 1NC and your counterplan is conditional and the AF makes a bunch of arguments there, and we'll talk about the different types of arguments, but they say the counterplan causes, the counterplan doesn't solve, but it also causes, some bad thing to happen. And the neg counterplan is conditional, we could say, we're not going for it, we don't care. If the counterplan is unconditional, and we, all the same stuff happens, we're still going for it. The 2 and R is still going for it. It's like, we're going to answer all of these offensive arguments, we are extending the counterplan in the 2 and R no matter what happens. And then dispositional says it depends on what the affirmative responses are. So if the affirmative responses are only offensive, we are stuck with the counterplan and we will extend it. But if the counterplan, if the negative, or if the affirmative makes defensive arguments, we can concede those defensive arguments and kick the counterplan. Does that make a little more sense? Yes?
How can you identify which counterplan fits into which status?
Oh, great question. The status of the counterplan is determined by the negative in the debate. So you, as the 1NC, as the negative, decide which way that you're reading the counterplan. So it is up to the negative debaters, and it doesn't like map onto the types of counterplans. It's just unrelated. Great question. Yes.
Would the other team know which type of counterplan is using?
Sorry.
Would the other team know which type of counterplan?
They will ask. So 99% of the time, it is a cross-ex question where the affirmative says, what is the status of the counterplan? And the negative answers with one of these 3 responses. Good question. John?
So this has never happened to me, but if they tell you unconditional cross-ex and they end up dropping it, what would you do?
You would say that is a voting issue. You would say they lied about the status of the counterplan, you should vote negative, or you should vote affirmative. That sucks. Good question. We will circle back to, if we end up with time, we'll circle back to kind of the theoretical justifications and arguments about these different statuses, but the most important takeaway here is you should be prepared to defend whichever status you choose. So if you are reading counterplans conditionally, which most of you probably will, you should be prepared to defend that conditionality is good. Because the AF is going to say that conditionality is bad. We will circle back to that. Any other questions on the status stuff? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about counterplans on the NATO topic. We talked about some examples that were very specific to the packet, but I want to talk about counterplans that you'll see that are more generic or general in nature. So the first is agent counterplans, and I think that 2 versions of this that you're likely to see are these first two kind of go together, because you could have NATO do the plan unilaterally, or however you would say that. You could have the US do the plan unilaterally. Both of those would be either agent counterplans or they would be PICs. We talked about this earlier. Often, agent counterplans are kind of a type of PIC. Next is bilateral counterplans. So instead of doing the counterplan with NATO, or doing the plan with NATO, instead of cooperation with NATO, the negative might say we should cooperate with China or some other country. Doesn't make a ton of sense with the packet affirmative because it's very specific to Article 5. But if the AF was to develop a certain form of AI, the counterplan to develop that AI with China would make more sense. So the other kind of areas of the topic, you might see more bilateral counterplans. Private sector counterplans. This, you will similarly see the private sector counterplans with AFs that are about tech, particular development or distribution or dissemination of particular technologies. Instead of having so the US and NATO together is the resolution and what the AF does, the negative could have the private sector develop that technology instead. So if it was, develop particular biotech to solve warming, you could have the private sector develop that technology instead. Condition counterplans you might see, and condition counterplans are a type of process counterplan. So they say instead of just doing the plan, we should condition whether the plan happens on some external thing or on some other thing happening. So they might condition the plan on Russia agreeing to something or on NATO implementing some policy before we cooperate with them. Condition counterplans are a type of process counterplans. So let's talk about what the net benefits are to each of these. What are the possible net benefits for an agent counterplan that just has NATO do the plan? Ted.
Anything that has to do with like for example, midterm just add in the packet says that like the U.S. flipping the script on Russia is bad. So if you just have NATO do it, the U.S. is not doing it alone. Probably links out to that.
Yep, good. So any disad that is about U.S. politics could be a net benefit to having NATO do the plan alone. Elon.
Avoids like U.S. hegemony or like North American imperialism.
Sure, yeah, you could say that NATO doing the plan alone is avoids kind of the U.S. leadership, and U.S. leadership is bad. That's good. What are some possible net benefits to the U.S. doing the plan unilaterally, not involving NATO? Aaron.
You don't want to have to worry about all of NATO's individual actors.
So I think that's a solvency argument rather than a disad. Like if you're saying like, I think maybe a version of what you're saying is like all of the NATO buy-in that is required for NATO action is bad for some reason. So NATO bad, Parker?
Maybe like NATO and the United States doing it is like too threatening towards Russia.
Sorry, say that again?
Okay, maybe like NATO, which is like Russia sees as a threat, like working with the US, like is too threatening for Russia, causes international conflict.
Oh sure, so like a Russia relations disad maybe? Yeah. Aziz.
I'm a little confused on how NATO unilaterally is different from the plan.
Because the plan involves the US.
Right.
Are you saying because NATO also includes the US, it would be functionally the same? Great question. I think that is a good argument for the affirmative to make, to say that it doesn't compete because US is part of NATO, so NATO doing the plan alone doesn't make any sense. The way that this would probably be written is to pick out of the US, so to say excluding the US, NATO countries should do this. Good question. What about net benefits to a bilateral cooperation counterplan? Ted.
Right now, like China is working with us on like climate change with biofuel. If we don't ask them, they might not do. Something along those lines, like cooperation with X other countries would be resolving an issue.
Yeah, so just ads that are about the relations with the other country that we picked to do the plan with instead. You see?
Well, like China, working with China, like Russia could see like, oh, the U.S., especially like the U.S. and China working together, like them wanting to start a war, like the likelihood of that would decrease and it would like de-escalate any type of like conflict or like cyber.
Okay, so maybe you just said about Russia perception. Eli?
Like cooperation with Ukraine is key to saving the region.
Sure, yeah, so it just said about, yeah, that kind of gets back to the other example about just like the perception of the other countries and cooperation with, you know, a particular country is good and is, you know, necessarily better than cooperation with NATO. Good. Net benefits about the private sector doing the plan. Ted.
Business confidence, especially if they like to regulate the type of AI. Business community might know what type of AI is economically good to regulate, what type is bad to regulate, etc.
Yep. Were you going to say something behind you? Yeah, good. Business confidence. So the plan, the federal regulation is bad, or federal development of particular technologies is a form of regulation, which hurts business confidence. That's key to the economy. Just said about that. Aziz?
Sorry, I missed it the first time. What is the private sector counterplan saying?
The private sector counterplan is something you might see with, it doesn't make any sense for the like packet affirmative, but for any app that is about development of a particular type of AI, a particular type of biotech, a particular like cyber product, have the private sector develop that product instead of the government. Yes?
Could you go over net benefits one more time? I think I forgot to write them down.
Yeah, sure thing. A net benefit is a disad that is triggered by the plan but not the counterplan. So a disad that the counterplan avoids but the plan causes. Eli?
Private actors don't spark like Russian attacks or Russian aggression.
Okay, I think that might be more of a solvency argument. So like we solve the F because the private. I guess you could have it just said about that. Sure, more perception stuff. And then the net benefit to a condition counterplan would just be that that process of conditioning the plan is good for some reason. So conditioning the plan on, you know, NATO getting their house in order on some particular thing is good for that reason. Condition the plan on that thing happening, that thing is good. A counterplan that we haven't talked about yet is a pretty different type of counterplan would be to withdraw from NATO. So the F cooperates with NATO, the counterplan withdraws from NATO. This, I think, will be a counterplan, a very strategic counterplan to have in your arsenal on this topic. It is mutually exclusive with the plan because you cannot both cooperate with NATO and withdraw from NATO. The net benefit is to say that NATO is bad. It is generic. It will apply to every app. And it is not that common that you can run into a counterplan that you can genuinely read against every single affirmative. This is a uniqueness counterplan that provides uniqueness for NATO bad turns or NATO bad, disad. It is also what is called a ban the plan counterplan, which is a category of counterplans we didn't really talk about, which is one that makes the plan illegal. So withdrawing from NATO makes cooperation with NATO impossible. It is a ban the plan counterplan. What is the big difference between this counterplan and the others that we've discussed? Yeah.
It doesn't solve
Good. So we are not trying to solve that. We are saying that we should withdraw from NATO rather than trying to solve all of your NATO good stuff. We are saying NATO is bad. Yes, Teddy.
Could you run this as a plank on an advantage counterplan with other ways that we could solve bioterror or whatever, and then also get out of Nato to have the Nato bad disad as an advantage to the counterplay?
You could.
Wait, can you repeat?
Teddy wanted to know whether you could withdraw from Nato as a plank or one part of a different counterplan. So if you have an advantage counterplan that's like do a bunch of cyber defense stuff, could you also withdraw from Nato as a different plank to that counterplan? And then the kind of change that makes is that it makes the debate bigger, or changes what you're likely to have the debate be about, but it's definitely possible. Other questions about that? Oops, that was wrong. I want to talk briefly about put our AF hats on for a minute, and talk about how we answer counterplans, and then we're going to talk about answering those answers. So the acronym that we like to use for affirmative answers to counterplans is POSTL, P-O-S-T-L. P stands for permutations. We kind of already talked about those. I would not just make one permutation. I would make multiple different types of permutation arguments against a counterplan. So I would say it is possible to do both the plan and the counterplan. I would say that permutation do the counterplan demonstrates that the counterplan is not competitive. I would say permutation do the plan and some part of the counterplan. Permutations. Second is offense. So the counterplan is bad for some reason. O stands for offense. The counterplan causes war with Russia. The counterplan, violates international law. Offense. S is for solvency deficits. The counterplan does not solve the affirmative case. This is the third thing, but it is arguably the most important component of answering counterplan, or at least most counterplans, which is to say that the counterplan does not resolve the advantages that you have set forth. T is for theory. We are going to make theoretical objections to the counterplan. We talked about a bunch of different types of theory. So no matter what the counterplan does, you have some kind of theoretical objection to it. Whether it is you read the counterplan conditionally, that is illegitimate. Whether it is the counterplan is international fiat, whether it is the counterplan, fiats through fiats the private sector, that's bad. Some theoretical objection. Yes.
They say their CP is unconditional. You should just let that slide. You shouldn't argue that they should have a conditional counterplan.
Yes. Okay. If you debate someone who says the counterplan is unconditional, I would not say unconditionality is bad. It is good for you because it means that you can make all of your offensive arguments and they'll matter. I would spend a bunch of time on that counterplan because you know it's going to be the 2 and R, and your theoretical objections would be some other kind of theoretical objections. Good question. And then L is for links to the net benefit. So the counterplan, in order to be good for the negative, has to have a net benefit. The AF wants to say the counterplan doesn't actually avoid the disad that it has presented. It still triggers the counterplan, or still triggers the disad. So links to the net benefit. So I want to talk about the negative since we're mostly AF hats off, neg hats back on. Since we're mostly talking about the neg, I want to talk about how we are responding to each of these arguments. Whenever the AF makes a permutation, you want to do a couple of things. The first is to establish that the permutation still links to the net benefit, or triggers the link to the disad that you're reading in conjunction with the counterplan. So establish that the counterplan links to the net benefit. Second, and when you're establishing the counterplan links to the net benefit, it is generally pretty easy to do this if the permutation includes the plan, because your link will be about the plan in the first place. And most permutations do include the plan, so if your link is actually about the plan, you should be able to win that it links to the net benefit relatively cleanly. Second, argue that the permutation is theoretically illegitimate. This is not as likely to be your kind of angle if the permutation is just do both, but it could be. A legitimate permutation must include the following. A legitimate AF permutation must include all of the plan and some or all of the counterplan. A legitimate permutation must include all of the plan and some or all of the counterplan. Yes?
How do you argue some of the counterplan?
So, like, if the counterplan is to, let me think of an example. So let's go back to the Teddy's example where he was like, let's read an advantage counterplan and let's withdraw from Nato at the same time. A permutation could be do the plan and the advantage counterplan part, but not withdraw from Nato. So some of the counterplan, like one plank, for example. So your arguments on the negative to answer permutations, generally, your theoretical objections to permutations are generally in one of two categories. You might say that they are severance, or you might say that they are intrinsic. Severance means that it is not a legitimate permutation because it does not include all of the plan. It severs out of part of the plan. That is said to be illegitimate because it makes the AF a moving target. It makes it impossible to know what the AF is going to defend. Makes the next job very difficult. Yes?
Could you argue that like the perm doesn't work because it like by like perming the CP, it just like it actually makes the problem worse?
Sure, yeah, you could say that the permutation makes things worse, absolutely. That would be kind of like, here's some new offense against the permutation. So severance means that the permutation does not include all of the plan. Severance part of the plan, that is bad. Second is the permutation is intrinsic. Intrinsic means that the permutation includes something that is in neither the plan nor the counterplan. So the AF might say, you know, permutation, do the plan and the counterplan, and send food aid to Ukraine. That is intrinsic because it adds a totally unrelated thing. That similarly makes it very difficult to be negative because the AF could add or append anything it wants to the permutation to get out of negative offense. A better example maybe would be perm, do the plan and the counterplan, and don't spend political capital. You read a politics essay about political capital, and the permutation adds a plank that gets out of that link. So that is intrinsic. Whenever you're having a permutation, you're negative, and you're having a debate about the permutation and whether it is legitimate, it is very useful to have evidence to support the competition of your counterplan. So read evidence to support the competitiveness of your counterplan to prove that the permutation is illegitimate. When you're responding to offense, pretty basic steps here. You want to have some defensive answers to whatever offense they have. You want to say there's no link to this offense. The counterplan doesn't cause that thing that you said. You want to say there's no impact to that offense. The implications of whatever thing that you said are not very bad. So general, just like have defense to the offense that they read to your counterplan. You could make it offense for you. So you could read offensive arguments to respond to whatever they said. So if they said the counterplan is bad because it violates international law, you could say international law is bad. That generates another net benefit to the counterplan for you. So it makes it net offense for you. Argue that the net benefit outweighs. So you want to say that your disad that you are reading is more significant than the offense that they've read against the counterplan. And then the final hack, if they read offense against your counterplan, is to counterplan out of the offense. So if they say the counterplan is bad because let's say you're reading a private sector counterplan and they say the private sector doing the plan is bad because it, you know, ruins, it results in some very unanticipated externalities to private sector action. You could counterplan to say have the private sector not do the bad thing. So that is theoretically risky because the AF is going to say like, WTF, did you just do? But if you're prepared, it's a useful hack. So you should be prepared to say that 2NC counterplans are good. Yes?
Do you think that there's a point in which saying that, like changing your counterplan, like what speech would you say changing your counterplan is probably going to lose on theory?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Like if you're in the 2 and R and you say, oh, we just changed the counterplan now, I feel like
2 and R counterplans are unusual.
Yeah, like just sort of change. So would you say like?
I would say that in the 2NC, you know, it's risky, but you can do it. In the 1 and R, I would not do it in a rebuttal.
Okay.
But I mean, look, do you, like no one's, it's incumbent upon the AF to, you know, prove that you did a bad thing. So like, try it out. I'm not policing you. Yeah, oh no, did you have a follow-up?
I was just wondering at what point, do you think after you should always introduce the CP in the 1NC? Or
Yes. Counterplans should be introduced in the 1NC. If you want to make changes or add to them, you can do that in the 2NC. But it does not make sense to introduce a counterplan for the first time in the 2NC, and I'll tell you why. Late-breaking debates are good for the AF and bad for the neg. If you introduce a brand new argument for the first time in the 2NC, the AF gets 2 speeches to respond to it, and you only get 1 speech to extend it. So it's much harder than introducing things in the 1NC and then developing them. Ted.
Never mind, you answered the question.
Great. Also, I had a total boomer moment, and I forgot the A in postal. But I now can't change my slideshow. So I'm going to start from current slide. We'll talk about solvency deficits in a second. A, in the AF hats on, postal, that acronym that we just talked about, you can also read add-ons. So an add-on is an advantage to the AF that was not in the 1AC. And for an add-on to be useful, you want it to be an add-on that the counterplane does not solve. Sorry, I did not mean to cause chaos, but I just realized that. Teddy.
Could you change your counterplan into a C to include the add-on?
Yes, you could counterplan out of the add-on too. Okay, responding to solvency deficits on the negative, you want to start by using 1NC solvency evidence to answer them. So ideally, the solvency evidence in the 1NC is good enough to you know, establish that you solve the AF. You want to apply whatever you've already said on this issue to the solvency deficit. Second, you want to discuss the solvency of the counterplane in terms of each AF advantage. So at the end of the debate, the judge is going to look at your counterplane and the plan to decide which is better, and they're going to think, does the counterplane solve this advantage, and does it solve that advantage, or the other one? So you want to discuss it in terms of each unique point of offense that the AF has. You want to set up a threshold for evaluating AF internal link claims. What do I mean by that? So this is a really good counterplane debating is just case debating. I know I said earlier that it means that you don't have to worry about the case, but at the end of the day, good counterplane debating is just case debating. You should discuss the specific thresholds that are set by affirmative evidence to establish what is necessary for the counterplan to solve for any action to resolve the advantages that they've set out. Parker.
Is this like sufficiency framing?
So that is an example of threshold setting. I think it is a little bit overused, but Parker is asking about the kind of argument that the negative sometimes makes, which is to say that the counterplane does not need to be as good as the affirmative at solving the impacts as long as it is sufficient to solve those impacts. So it does not need to be, the counterplane does not need to be at the same level as the AF as long as it solves the terminal impact or resolves sufficient or enough of the AF to avoid the impacts. Yes?
Works because you have descent on the AF.
In part, yeah. Partly that framing makes sense if you have a net benefit that can outweigh the whatever solvency deficit is left. But part of what you're trying to do with sufficiency framing is establish that you can, that the AF problems can go away even if you don't do the plan, if you do this other thing. So like that the terminal impacts to the affirmative will not occur if we do just enough to get out of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but why, so what's there for preferring doing just enough?
Oh, well, the dissent, you're right.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you want to read more evidence. So read more solvency evidence, always read more solvency evidence unless the 2AC does not answer the counterclaim. Theory, so responding to theory arguments. This is a useful place to have a lot of blocks written. So a block is a pre-written set of arguments that you make, before the debate in preparation for having a debate. Theory, this is a place where blocks come in extremely useful. So have theory blocks that defend the theoretical legitimacy of your counterclaim. Part of what you want to do on any theory debate that is not conditionality is to win that excluding the counterclaim would be bad. So if you can win that your counterclaim is reasonably grounded in the literature, or it is particularly important to learn about or educational, you can win that the AF's theory argument wants you to get rid of that counterclaim entirely, and that would be bad for a debate. The other hack that you can use for theory, and again, this excludes status theory, but the other thing that you can do is to say that if you win competition, if you win that your counterclaim competes, it should be theoretically legitimate. If you win that your counterclaim competes, it ought to be theoretically legitimate. Why do I say that? Well, it means that the counterclaim is a reasonable alternative to the plan, and that excluding it would be excluding or disregarding an important discussion in the literature, right? So if you win that your counterclaim is theoretically legitimate or is competitive, you ought to be able to win that it is also theoretically legitimate, and the AF ought to be prepared to debate it. Does that make sense? Finally, responding to links to the net benefit. I have the very sophisticated argument, no it doesn't. Hopefully that is the case. Ideally, you have read a counterplan that says that does not link to your net benefit. So answer the argument, say that it doesn't link to the net benefit, and explain how it avoids the net benefit. And then the other kind of trick that the negative will sometimes use is to say that the net benefit question is a sliding scale. So then the AF wants to say it's an up or down, yes or no question, and to say the counterclaim either triggers the net benefit or it doesn't. And we say it does. The negative wants to say, whoa, 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 hold your horses. This is not a yes or no question. This is not an up or down. Counterclaims you can link more. You can be more likely to cause a disadd and less likely, and the counterclaim is less likely to cause the disadd. It is toward the end of the scale that it does not link, so you should prefer it. Does that make sense? And then responding to add-ons is very similar to responding to offense. You want to read defense to the add-ons. You can say that the counterclaim solves them if you think it does, or as Teddy said, you can counterclaim out of the add-ons. Okay, it's just about 11, so that's all I got. Do you have any last questions before you go? Yes? Sorry, repeat what I said about add-ons. What? The first time. So an add-on is an advantage to the plan that is not in the 1AC that the 2AC reads. And ideally, hey, just 1 second, y'all, sorry. And that ideally are not solved by the counterclaim. Yes? Permutation? It's a test of competition that establishes whether it is possible to do both the plan and the counterclaim. Okay, thanks y'all.